Every man rejected the mute bride, until a deaf farmer read her hands and wept. I want to tell you about a pair of hands. Not the way a man talks about a woman's hands when he's trying to sound tender. I mean, I want to tell you what those hands said to me, and what they cost her to say it, and why I've never once in 31 years gone a full day without thinking about them. Her name was Cecilia Voss. She came off a train out of Omaha on a Tuesday in October, 1878, and she was the 7th woman in 8 months to step down onto that platform in Hatchet Creek, Nebraska, and look around for a man who was not there to meet her. The man she was supposed to marry had been dead 3 weeks by then, kicked by a mule. His brother had sent the wire to the agency, or said he had, but by the time it might have reached Cecilia, she was already westbound on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, a small brown trunk in the rack above her head and $40 sewn into the hem of her coat. I know all this because she told me, not that day. Months later, in parts, the way you tell a thing when you've decided the person you're telling it to deserves to know. I wasn't on the platform. I didn't go to town much. Hatchet Creek had maybe 200 souls and a main street that was mostly mud and intention, and there wasn't a soul on it who could talk to me without either shouting into my ear or writing things down on a scrap of paper, and I had enough paper scraps by then to fill a flour sack. I'd been deaf since 32. A fever took 4 days to burn through me and left me on the other side in this particular silence that is not peaceful, the way some people imagine, but is instead a permanent awareness of every vibration in the earth, every change of air, every flicker of expression on a face across a room. I was 44 in October of 1878. My name is Elias Marsh. I had 160 acres of corn and winter wheat, a mule better tempered than the one that killed Cecilia's intended, a dog named Poverty, and a farmhouse I'd built myself with boards I'd milled myself from cottonwood I'd felled myself, which sounds like pride but is only fact. I had no wife. I had not had a wife since my wife Agnes died in 72 from something the doctor in Kearney called a wasting illness, which is how doctors name things they don't understand. I went into town that Tuesday because I needed nails, and because Poverty had gotten into a porcupine, and needed the attention of the man who kept dogs and knew how to pull quills without taking the skin. I saw her sitting on the steps of the freight office. The brown trunk was beside her. She had her hands in her lap, and she was watching the street the way you watch a street when you're trying not to look like you're scared, which means watching everything and registering nothing. She was dark-haired, not young, maybe 35, which I didn't know then but figured later. She had a quality of stillness that I recognized because I had it too. That stillness that comes from learning the world gives you information through surfaces and light, and the small movements of people, not through sound. I didn't stop. I had no reason to. I went to the hardware and bought my nails and then stood in the street for a minute reading the dust in the air, the way the trees to the northwest were moving, deciding whether there was weather coming by nightfall. There was. When I came out, she was still there. I went to her, not because I planned to. I went to her the way you go to a thing that pulls at you before you've had a chance to think about it sensibly. She looked up. I said, which is to say I spoke aloud because I can still speak. My voice just has no floor under it anymore. It comes out slightly wrong and people sometimes wince, I said. You need somewhere to go. She looked at me a long moment, then she opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it. She held up one finger, wait, and reached into the small bag beside her and pulled out a folded paper and a pencil, and she wrote, I cannot speak. I am mute from birth. Do you still wish to talk to me? I read it. I said, I'm deaf. I can speak, but I can't hear you, so we're about even. She stared at me. Then, and I didn't know what I was seeing yet, I had never seen it before in my life, her hands moved. Not gesturing, not pointing. Talking, her fingers and palms made shapes and sequences with a precision that was nothing like random movement, and I had no idea what any of it meant, but I knew it was language the way you know music is music even when you don't know the song. I said, I don't know what that is. She wrote sign language for the deaf and mute. You don't know it. I said, nobody ever taught me. She looked at me. This is the look I've tried to describe 100 times and never gotten right. Like she was recalculating something she'd already added up wrong, starting over from the beginning. She wrote, then I will teach you. I should tell you what had happened to her before she came to Nebraska. She was from Cincinnati. Her father had been a pharmacist, a decent man by her account, who had put her in the Ohio school for the deaf at age 6 because he thought she'd have a better life if she learned to communicate with people like herself. She'd been there 11 years. She'd learned to read and write and do figures and sew and cook and sign with a fluency that her teachers said was remarkable. And then her father died and her stepmother put her out. And she'd spent the next 8 years in a series of houses where she cooked and cleaned for families who treated her mute condition as a kind of useful affliction because she couldn't complain out loud. The mail-order arrangement had been her idea. She'd seen the agency's advertisement in a Cincinnati paper and thought, what is the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that can happen is I end up somewhere I don't want to be, which is what I already have. She'd been rejected by 2 men before she even boarded the train. She'd been honest in her letter to the agency about her condition, and they'd forwarded it to the clients anyway, and 2 of them wrote back to say they didn't think it would work. The man in Hatchet Creek, a homesteader named Durfield, the one the mule killed, had written back to say he didn't mind. She'd taken that as enough. And then she stepped off a train, and he was dead, and she had $40 and a trunk, and nowhere to go and no way to tell anyone about any of it without a piece of paper and a pencil. She'd been sitting on those freight office steps for 6 hours by the time I found her. I took her home. I want to be plain about the fact that this was not ordinary behavior for a man in 1878 in Nebraska or in most other places and times. I know what it looked like. I know what people said. I will tell you what I told myself, which is that I had a spare room and a weather system coming out of the northwest, and a woman sitting in the October cold with nowhere to go, and that whatever else I was not a man who could leave that and sleep. Poverty came out and sniffed her boots and then sat down next to her, which was his way of accepting a person, and she looked at the dog and then at me, and for the first time she smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the smile of a person who has learned to keep things small and internal who momentarily forgets to. I put her trunk in the wagon, and we drove the 4 miles out to my land in the last of the daylight with the weather coming dark behind us, and I don't know what she was thinking. I was thinking about the shape her hands had made. She stayed. Not because I asked her to. Not immediately, anyway. She stayed the first night because of the weather. It came in hard about 2 in the morning, sleet and 30-mile wind, and by morning there was ice on the pump handle and nobody was going anywhere. She made breakfast. I came downstairs to find the stove going and coffee made and eggs and cornbread on the table. And she was standing at the window watching the ice on the cottonwoods with her arms folded around herself. Not warmth, protection, the way a person holds themselves when they're deciding whether a place is safe. I ate, she watched me eat, and then ate herself. We passed the notepad back and forth. She wrote, "How long have you been here alone?" I said, "Wrote 6 years. Is it hard?" I thought about it. I wrote, "The work isn't hard, the silence is." She read it, and something shifted in her face. She took the pad and wrote for a longer time than any of the others. I have been silent my whole life, and I have never once found it peaceful. People say the deaf and mute must have such inner lives. They mean it as a kindness. What they don't understand is that the inner life is also loud. It just doesn't have anywhere to go. I read it twice. I said yes. Just the one word, but she nodded like I'd said something important. She taught me signs. This happened over weeks at the table in the evenings after the work was done. She'd learned a formalized system at the school in Ohio. She showed me a book she had in her trunk, a manual of signs with illustrations. But she told me on the notepad that she'd also developed her own signs with certain people over the years, shortcuts and inventions, a private language inside the official one. I was a slow student. My hands were farmers' hands, thick in the joints, not made for precision. She would take my hands in hers and move them into the right shapes, and I'd feel the position and try to remember it. Corn, both hands rotating slowly, as if shucking. Rain, fingers fluttering down like water. Dog, snap, then pat the thigh. Cold, fists tucked together, a shiver. I'm sorry, one hand on the chest, moving in a slow circle over the heart. I want to talk to you, both index fingers pointing, then turned toward myself. She was patient. She never laughed at me, though I could see sometimes she was suppressing it, her mouth pressed together and her eyes doing the work, And I didn't mind because the suppression itself was a kind of warmth. You only work that hard not to laugh at someone you've decided you don't want to hurt. By December, I could hold a slow conversation. By February, it was faster. By March, I could understand her without effort, the signs coming into my mind as meaning the way words come into most people's minds from sound. The notepad disappeared. That winter was severe, the worst I'd had on that land, and I'd had 10 winters on it. We lost 12 head of cattle to a blizzard in January. I found them stacked in the lee of the south pasture fence, frozen where they'd huddled, and I stood there in the snow looking at them long enough that she came looking for me. She found me standing with my hand on the flank of the nearest one, a 3-year-old Hereford I'd raised from a calf, and she came and stood beside me, and she didn't sign anything. She just stood there with her shoulder touching mine in that cold. That was when I knew. Not that I was going to do anything about it, but that I knew. There were things about her I learned slowly. She had a temper. Not violent, not cruel, but precise. If you did something she thought was stupid or wasteful or unkind, she would look at you with a directness that took a piece off you. And I think a lot of people in her life had mistaken her silence for passivity, and then been surprised by those eyes. She was funny. The signs gave her a register that writing didn't. She'd exaggerate the motion of a sign for comic effect, the way a person uses a voice for irony. And I started noticing that she was often saying something with one hand that contradicted what her face was doing, a dry undercut running beneath the apparent meaning, and this was not a thing I'd been able to perceive when we were passing a notepad. She was stubborn about work. I made the mistake once of finishing a fence repair she'd started because I thought I could do it faster. She came out and saw what I'd done and signed, slowly and deliberately. I was doing that. I signed back, "It's done." "I know it's done. I wanted to do it." "Why?" Long pause, then, "Because I wanted to know I could." I didn't finish her work again. She was afraid of horses. Not the way a nervous person is afraid. She didn't back away or flinch, but I saw her hands once on the rail of the corral and they were white at the knuckles, and I understood it was a managed fear, lived with, not resolved. I never asked her about it. Some things a person manages on their own and doesn't need company for. She read. She had 4 books in her trunk, and she read each one multiple times. And in the spring I drove into Kearney and bought her 6 more. And she looked at them spread on the table with an expression I'd only seen her use on the land, the particular, assessing attention of a person who takes a thing seriously. In April, the town decided to have a view about us. It was predictable. I'd known it would happen. What I hadn't anticipated was the specific form it would take, which was that Myra Aldrich, who ran the dry goods with her husband and served as the town's unofficial conscience, drove out to my farm on a Wednesday morning and spoke to Cecilia directly. I saw them from the far field. I couldn't hear, obviously, but I watched Myra talking and Cecilia listening, and then I saw Cecilia's hands begin to move, signing to someone who couldn't read it, and I understood that she was doing it anyway, making her answer in her own language even to someone who couldn't receive it, because it was the answer she had and she was giving it. When Myra left, Cecilia came out to where I was working. I signed. What did she want? Cecilia signed. She wanted to know if you are keeping me here against my wishes. What did you tell her? I showed her the door I came in through and the door I can leave through. Then I signed the rest. What did you sign? She paused, her hands shaped the words slowly. I told her that this man taught himself sign language to talk to me. That no one in my life had ever done that. That I would be grateful if she would mind her own affairs. I looked at her a while. I signed. She couldn't understand you. I know, she signed back, but I could. I want to be honest about the thing that almost broke it. In May, a man came through. His name was Prescott. He was a land agent out of Lincoln, young, well-dressed by frontier standards, with full hearing and a mouth that knew how to use it, and he stopped at my farm because he was passing through and needed water for his horse, which is a thing nobody refuses. He saw Cecilia. He stayed for supper, which I offered because it was what you did, and he was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they want something, attentive and warm and full of good stories. And I watched him talk to her and watched her respond on the notepad, and I ate my supper and said very little. He could give her a voice. That was the thought I had, not literally. But what I meant was he could speak asterisk for asterisk her. He could be her connection to a world that didn't know sign language, that would always require a notepad and a pencil, that would always treat her silence as a problem to work around. I was deaf. I gave her a language between us and nothing else. He could give her the world outside. He left the next morning early. I was at the pump when he went. He shook my hand and said something I couldn't read on his lips because the angle was wrong, and he rode off south. When I came in, Cecilia was at the table. She looked at me and signed, "I saw your face at supper." I signed, "What did you see?" "You thinking?" I said out loud, "I was thinking you could do better than a deaf farmer in the middle of nowhere." She watched my mouth. She knew my speech well enough by then to read it without much effort. She signed back, and she signed it slowly, not for emphasis, but because she wanted me to catch every word. I was not brought here for better. I was not brought here for a voice in the world. I have never once in my life needed someone to speak for me. I have a language now. I have land I can work, and a dog that chose me, and a man who took the trouble to learn my hands. She put both palms flat on the table. I have not been chosen many times in my life, Elias. I would like to be the one who chooses now. I stood in my kitchen for what must have been a full minute without moving. Then I sat down across from her and I put my hands over hers, both of them, and I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. What needed saying had been said, and she'd been the one to say it, and all I had to do was sit there and let it be true. We married in June in the Hatchet Creek Methodist Church, which was a single-room building with a piano nobody could tune correctly, and a minister named Hodge who was a decent man and who had learned in the 2 weeks prior 4 signs. I do asterisk, asterisk you asterisk, asterisk I, and the sign for love, which is arms crossed over your chest. He signed those 4 things to Cecilia at the right moment, and she looked startled, and then looked at me, and then looked back at him with an expression that I know now was her trying not to weep in public, which is a war she sometimes loses and sometimes wins. She won that day, barely. I didn't win it. I had already accepted the losing as part of the price of standing in that church in my good shirt with this woman beside me, and I was fine with paying it. I said I wanted to tell you about her hands. I've told you some of it. The signs she taught me, the way she used them, the flat palms on the table when she was saying something she decided to stand behind. Here is the rest. There is a night I come back to. November of that first winter, before we were anything to each other except 2 people sharing a house. I woke in the dark. I don't know what woke me, some vibration, the dog, a change in the air, and I lay there in my room and I felt the farmhouse around me the way I always feel it at night. Every timber and board a presence, and I felt too the awareness that the spare room was occupied, that there was another person in this building, which had not been true in 6 years. I lay there a while. Then I got up and went to the kitchen for water, and on the way back I passed her door, which was ajar, and I stopped. She was awake. She was sitting up in bed reading by lamplight, one of her books open on her knees, and her lips were moving. Not words, not forming words exactly, something else, and I stood there trying to understand what I was seeing, and I understood it finally. She was signing to herself. Her hands were making shapes in her lap, small, private signs, too small for conversation, too precise for mere movement. She was thinking in her language, running something through her hands the way another person would murmur it aloud. She hadn't heard me, obviously. I stood in that doorway, I don't know how long, and I watched a woman talk to herself in the only language she had, in the dark, in a house that was not hers, in a state she hadn't chosen, in a country that had not been kind to her. I went back to my room. I lay down, and for the first time in 6 years, I did not feel the particular, heavy silence of a man alone, in a house he built for a life that had not come. The story doesn't end dramatically. I want to be honest about that. We worked the farm. We had a child, a daughter born in 1880, whom we named Ruth, who could hear perfectly and whose first language was sign, because it was the one she learned from her mother before she understood there was another one. She grew up able to move between them without thinking about it, and I have watched her do this all her life, sliding from signs to speech in a single sentence, with a kind of amazement that never quite wore off. The farm grew. Good years and bad years, the way farms go. I broke my arm in '83 and it healed wrong, and I've had less strength in the left hand since, which Cecilia noticed before I said anything, and which she never mentioned directly but adjusted for quietly in the way she'd adjusted for other things, without making it a conversation about my limitation. I turned 60 in 1894. Cecilia made cornbread and we sat on the porch in the late afternoon, Ruth inside with her own family now, just the two of us, and Cecilia signed to me, slowly and without preamble. "What do you think about?" I thought about it, then I signed, the same things I always thought about. "Which are?" I looked at her. I signed, you, the land, Ruth, whether the Northwest field wants a different rotation next spring, whether poverty understood more than a dog should, whether the cedar post on the south fence will last another winter. She looked at the field. After a while she signed, "Asterisk, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been at the freight office that day?" I said out loud, the way I do sometimes when I want her to see it in my face as well as my hands. I try not to. She read my lips. She signed, "Why not?" "Because," I said, "it would have been too much to know you were out there and I didn't find you." She is 71 now. I am 78. Her hair went gray in her 50s and white in her 60s, and she wears it plain, pulled back, the way she always has. The hands are the same hands, a little slower some days, and the first joints of the fingers on her right hand have gotten thick the way mine did, from work and from weather. And in the evenings, sometimes she'll stop signing mid-sentence and flex them and look at them with the mild annoyance of a person whose tools are not cooperating. I watch her do that and I think about the freight office steps and the notepad and the first sign she ever taught me, which was asterisk thank you, one hand opening from the chin like something being released. And I think about how the first thing she taught me to say was the thing I most needed to be able to say to her, and whether she knew that or whether it was just the logical place to start. I have never asked. There are some things you hold rather than examine. You hold them the way you hold a worn piece of wood that fits your hand, not because you don't know what it is, but because knowing doesn't add anything to the holding. The cedar post on the south fence, for what it's worth, outlasted that winter and every winter since. And